As we approach the end of our liturgical year, you notice that the readings get a bit apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is a word that's often misunderstood because really what it means, it's a word that has a Greek origin that just means the unveiling, the pulling back. If you remember, as you're growing up, the last book in the Old Testament once used to be called the book of Apocalypse, and now it's called the book of Revelation. They both basically mean the same thing. It's a revealing or a pulling back of the veil to see really what our spiritual realities. Several years ago, I was having breakfast with a group of parishioners many years before I was a priest. And there was a guest priest, because we would go out after Mass. There was a guest priest, so we invited him out for breakfast. And as we were sitting there, he was relating a story to us. Now, a priest, oftentimes, they have this benefit of being offered free cruises because the cruise ships, all they have to do is say Mass, hear confessions, or do any sacramental stuff on the ship, and their way is paid. And so he decided to take one of the cruise lines up on this. Now, if you've ever been on a cruise, you know that at some point there's something hosted called the Captain's Dinner. And the Captain's Dinner is a night where you dress up in your formal wear. You're actually supposed to bring formal wear onto the cruise. They serve the best food, the best wines, and the best meal, and have the best service. And it's really sort of an uppity dinner that anyone on the ship is invited to, provided they prepare for the occasion. But there are regular dinners that precede the Captain's Dinner, and so this priest, being on the ship, was going to dinner night after night. He wasn't wearing his priestly clothes. And so for 5 or 6 nights in a row, he sat down with a group of people that were having conversations about life and anything, I suppose. And he never revealed the fact that he was a priest to them until the Captain's Dinner came, when, as you're required to do or asked to do, you dress in your formal attire. He wore his clerics. And as the group was sitting down around the table, he was the last one in the room. He began to approach the table, and as they looked over, they saw a man that they thought they recognized. And when he pulled the chair down, they knew that, in fact, that the conversations that they had had the last 5 or 6 days or meals with this man happened to be in the presence of somebody who didn't know at the time was a priest. And the priest smiled as he sat down, and he said he wasn't saying it, but he was thinking he could see the wheels in their heads turning, playing back the conversations they had had the last 5 or 6 days, wondering if they had said something that might have been a little off. He thought it was kind of funny. But that priest, friends, in that situation really represented for that group of people the presence of God. The idea that so oftentimes we go ahead in our lives and we focus on the wrong things. That we're focused so much on life, and life is great. All the things that we do, that's wonderful, but so oftentimes they're done without really recognizing the presence of God in those activities. And it was a reminder to those people sitting around the table about reviewing their lives and thinking about what the presence of God really meant and where their focus should be. Today I want to talk about the homily, or I want to talk specifically about the gospel. Catholic tradition has that there's 2 ways of interpreting Scripture. They are the literal way, and they are the spiritual way. We interpret things scripturally literally by saying that this really actually happened, and also spiritually that this is something that we should see as something ongoing. Okay, something that we should all be able to relate to in our lives as Christians. So the first thing I want to talk about is just how this literally relates. In the first century, about the time when Luke was writing this gospel, Jesus indeed had made this prediction talking about the temple. They're gathered around the temple, and there's people making comments about how beautiful it was. The temple had been restored by Herod the Great. He had put tons of money into it to win favor of the Jewish people, but really he was a vassal of the Roman emperor. So he wasn't necessarily a friend of the people, but they liked him because he made their temple very fancy. And there was people talking about how beautiful the temple was, and for the ancient world, it was supposedly the most beautiful building in the ancient world ever. And you can imagine probably what that would have looked like. But Jesus is kind of a downer here, right? He says, look at these beautiful buildings, look at the stones, look at the votive offerings, all the devotion here in this temple. And Jesus says, all that you see here, the days will come when will not be left a stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down. Well, that's kind of a downer. I remember years ago, Bishop Robert Barron was, when he first got to know his Archbishop in Chicago, Cardinal Francis George, they were walking through Washington, D.C. on the Mall, and Bishop Barron was a priest at the time of the Archdiocese of Chicago, didn't know what to talk to a cardinal about. And so he just started making reference to things around him, and he said, "Hey, Cardinal, what do you think about all these beautiful monuments in Washington?" And Cardinal George, he's passed now, but he said, "Yes, they are beautiful, and they'll all be destroyed someday." So he kind of had Cardinal George always had, he understood where the focus always had to be, and he understood the real temporariness of the world around us. That, as St. Paul said, the world is passing away. Jesus' prediction today in the gospel, friends, actually came true. The Jews at that time were very focused because the temple was the very presence of God, and I've said it over and over again, I think, in my homilies, just about how if there was no temple, there was no presence of God in Israel. That's how firmly they believed that the temple meant that God was present among them, and if there was no temple, they were scattered. They were kind of disordered, spread, dispersed. Well, in the year 66, there was a revolt. Again, the Jews were focusing on the wrong thing. They were worried about Roman oppression. They didn't like the fact that Rome was ruling over them. They were angry and they were restless. And in the year 66, when Roman presence was very sparse in Jerusalem, they revolted. And for a time, for a year or so, they believed that they had somehow thrown off the yoke of the Romans. The reality is the Romans pretty much let you practice your faith as you wanted to. They didn't really have any issue with that. It was all the revolts that kept happening. They were focused on the wrong thing, not on the presence of God in the temple, but they were focused on the Romans around them. And when they revolted against the Romans, you can imagine what happened. It was only a few short years when they mobilized their armies, and then some historians say they sent as many as 1 million people, 1 million soldiers down to Jerusalem. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but they sent legions down to Jerusalem. The people took refuge in Jerusalem, but the Romans simply surrounded them, and for years they just waited. They had no food. They had revolted, again, focusing on the wrong things. They had focused on the Roman oppression and attempted to do something about it. And they had focused on the wrong things, and when they tried to revolt, the reality is the Romans came and they starved them out. So much to their shame, friends, I say this during a homily, but they had resort to cannibalism. It was one of the most shameful periods in Jewish life. They who taught that you couldn't even come into contact with a corpse now had resorted to one of the most detestable things that a person could resort to in their life. And in 70 AD, the temple, in fact, after they had were overcome by Rome, the temple was in fact destroyed. The Christians at that time, knowing this prediction that Jesus had talked about, there will not be one stone that is not thrown down, that came true. And for Christians living in that time, they recognized the fact that their faith, their newfound Christian faith, was a continuation of the presence of God, not in the temple, but in the very person of Jesus. So the fullness of divinity in their eyes resided in the temple, but the new temple, Jesus himself, the fullness of divinity resided in him. And it was in his resurrection where he was no longer bound by time and space, where they could worship God in a new way. No longer confined to the temple, but now through baptism, something that was the very presence within them. And so when they hear this, you hear of wars and insurrections. You see that many people come and say, what we really need to be focused on is the Romans. Jesus told them very clearly, don't focus on that. Focus on uniting your heart with the presence you've been given in your baptism. So that was the literal meaning of the gospel today, that in fact nations were rising against nations and kingdom against kingdoms. There were in fact earthquakes, famines, as I mentioned, plagues that were the result of that forced enclosure and forced surrender. Sights and signs in the sky too, because there would have been archers' arrows flying over them. That was the literal meaning. Spiritually, what does it mean though? I think people know that there is a great persecution going on of Christians around the world. Does everybody understand that? So oftentimes I hear people, everybody knows I think most people know what's going on in Rome right now with the Amazon Synod, the Pachamama scandal. Can I just have a show of hands? Because I don't know how many of you keep up on that or not. I've been hesitant to talk about it only because the reality is I often think it's because we're focused on the wrong stuff. I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about that. But the reality is, friends, when the Jews focused on the wrong things, when they focused on what was killing them, they were missing something. Christ gave us a new way to worship God in His presence, not only in the sacraments and the Eucharist, but He asks us to refocus, to recalibrate. The great Saint John Vianney said, in his time, it was things that were going on in the culture. They were divided because of the French Revolution that said the only thing we can really know is through science and rational inquiry, and faith doesn't mean anything anymore. Faith is just for simple people. And that was a lie. That was a false teacher. And St. John Vianney, knowing that, said, do not raise your voice in front of the newspaper, raise your voice in front of the tabernacle. Because he's the one that can do something about it. You could probably say today, do not raise your voice in front of the television. Maybe if you talked a little louder, the people would hear you. Do not raise your voice in front of the television, raise your voice in front of the tabernacle, raise your voice to God, refocus. Refocus. That's why Jesus says there will be wars and insurrections. Do not be terrified. Why? Because you have within you already the one thing that is stable in life. The one thing and the only thing that you can depend on is God's presence, worshipped in a new way, not confined by a temple, but given to us every Sunday in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and the abiding presence that remains within us for all eternity. So oftentimes when we come to this apocalyptic literature, we read things on the internet oftentimes that make us pause and think, is this the end? Is this the end of the world? Where are we going? And why are we in a handbasket? And it's not that that stuff is important to talk about, to look at. Certainly, people that I know that have come into the church recently, people that I think scandalized by a lot of what's happening in the church, I always redirect their focus. Yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff happening, but you know what? You've got Jesus. Don't forget it. Because if you do, it's a very subtle temptation for the devil to lead you away from the one abiding presence that can bring you from death to life, that can bring you from sadness to circumstances to joy in the reality of His presence. And so we ask ourselves today, as we continue this Mass, what our focus is on. Like the people in that conversation on that cruise ship that were basically talking just whatever they wanted about without knowing that that priest was present who really sort of represented God. When that priest came and sat down and that review they did of their life or their conversations in the past 5 days, if they had been aware that that priest was present the entire time, they would have simply been aware of their conversations. They would have been aware of their actions. They would have been aware of what they were saying. The reality is, friends, is that for us Christians, Jesus is always present to us. He's always present here. And the question is, friends, the beauty, again, because Jesus' presence, the presence of the divinity that once resided in the temple, now resided in Jesus, the reality is that Jesus took on our image and likeness. Right? Jesus is the new temple. And as the new temple, He took on humanity. He united Himself to us. Yet St. John Vianney said, a soul when it prays and asks for that union with God becomes indistinct like two pieces of wax that are melded together. And the joy of a person united to God can save more souls can save more souls than any amount of teaching or criticism. And so the point today is to refocus. If we invite God into our lives, we know also the reality is that we may have to make a confession. We may have to make a review of our lives to ask God to help us refocus on the right things. Because any loss of peace, and I know this from a number of years of doing spiritual direction, the one thing that we do in spiritual direction is we ask a person to find the peace that God gives them in that relationship with the eternal, and how to maintain that throughout their lives, regardless of the circumstances. And it is a battle. Because there are many that say they come in Jesus' name, and they know the day, and they know the hour, and Jesus says, no, they don't. And what does it matter anyway if we're already united to the eternal God? Wars, insurrections, instability, scandal. Be at peace. Take care of your own soul, and you will save the souls of those around you. So friends, today as we receive communion, focus on that presence of God that you receive. Focus on the fact that the Creator of the universe is being here made present for you and encouraging you to unite your soul and your heart to Him, because He wants to be united eternally with you.